Okay, welcome back. So I realized that last one might have been a little bit of a short one, but that way we can finish off on this one and kind of spread the load over different videos here. I want to talk about Renaissance art, Renaissance painting specifically. So the thing that people are really excited about, and the reason why the Renaissance is celebrated over other time periods for its art, is that in the Renaissance they develop realism in painting. Um, Basically, realism being able to depict things in a way that looks so lifelike that you might wonder if you were looking at just the thing itself. I would say almost like a photograph, except that nobody has this concept yet. But things that are so realistic, they might as well be photographs, or might as well be the actual things themselves. That is something that artists have tried to figure out in various time periods, and it's kind of a technology that has to be developed. Some artists have developed it really very far and in depth. And if you're sort of down on the Middle Ages, you might say that this technique is not as well developed during the Middle Ages. It's kind of forgotten. Well, the Renaissance sees it as the perfect time to bring back everything that has been forgotten. So they are going to bring back realistic painting. And this style of painting is also known as illusionistic because it's so real that it creates the illusion of reality. And to do that, it helps to have some knowledge of like science, of light and shadow and how all that works, of the shapes of things, of the shapes of bodies. So this is good because we're already investigating all of these things as well. But the Renaissance wasn't the first time period to figure out some elements of realism. Take a look at what the Romans figured out in their painting. By Roman times, wall painting had become pretty realistic. We see here, the details of this chair, of the woman's clothes, of the lyre that she's playing. They are all pretty well figured out. And we look at this and we say, yeah, that's some pretty, well done painting right there. But there is one thing that the Romans had not figured out, and that was long distance perspective. I want to show you another Roman wall painting that really illustrates what I mean. This one right here. So there's, this is well done on many levels, this picture. And this is one of the paintings that we might see. I believe this comes from Pompeii or Herculaneum, one of the Roman cities that were buried by volcanic debris. Because that's where we get most of our intact paintings from, because they were buried. But look at this one. What's wrong with this picture? A lot of things technically correct, a lot of sense of light and shadow, there's lots of architectural details like columns and whatnot are very well done and whatnot. But you can't escape the impression that this painting wasn't well done. And that's because the shapes of things are going in completely different directions. This building is going in this way, whereas these buildings are going a completely different direction, and it doesn't match with these ones down here, and the ladder is kind of lopsided, and this is kind of maybe matching to these buildings more than this building. Yes, even though this one is in front of this building, it matches these buildings behind it much more. So this is what happens when you don't have perspective in your art. And so what do I mean by perspective? Perspective is figuring out sort of the way the things exist in relation to one another. And that was something that was really pioneered in the Renaissance. It all has to do with the idea of a vanishing point. Basically, the way sight works and the way light works is that it seems almost to go towards the horizon. So things get smaller as they get further away from you, right? So if you just keep moving things further and further back, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you have to have a sense of that when you're designing things. And if you kind of draw something like this, where you draw the vanishing point and you draw lines coming off of it, and you draw the horizon where everything is going towards, then you can make things that are really realistic, like this room here. So artists of the Renaissance really did figure this out again. And that became an important, or really figured it out for the first time. I don't know if it was known by any other cultures. And that became an important part of how their art worked and part of why it was so good. One of the great Renaissance artists, and we'll talk about a lot more of them next time when we meet on Monday, but one of the great Renaissance artists was Masaccio. And Masaccio painted a lot of biblical scenes, drawing on some of the same techniques that we saw with Giotto. Giotto had a good sense of, contrasting light and dark, but Masaccio has a better sense of where light is actually coming from. He sees, for instance, that the light is all going to be on this one side here, and kind of plays it based on that. Although it's kind of more like he has it in groups, right? He has the group of people in the front and they've got their own light, and then the mountains have their own light, and then the building has its own light, and this other group of people here has a different kind of light. But he does have this understanding of light, and more importantly, he does have the vanishing point. He has perspective. Things get smaller in a very reasonable way as they get to a certain distance. So that's pretty cool. And this is the scene where in the Bible where Jesus and his disciples are asked to pay the money to the Roman governors. And Jesus basically has Peter take the money out of the mouth of a fish. He just miracles the money into existence. So that's a sign of how to deal with powerful people. And you better believe the Medicis and people like them were powerful people who want their money. So I can imagine it would have, had some resonance maybe. Here's some more by Masaccio. He did 2 Virgin Marys, which are very cool. He has that sort of creepy baby face here. That's one area where maybe they haven't figured out the realism. But then, I don't know how often these guys got to look at an actual baby. They were more too busy painting, or possibly they're just trying to give that like serious expression, like Jesus looks like an adult, even though he's a baby. But again, continuing that use of light and shadow is pretty cool. And these remind us of the one by Giotto and Cimabue as well. Another one by Masaccio is Raising of the Son of Theophilus of Antioch. So this is another biblical story. And so here again, we see the same sort of patterns of light and dark. We see the buildings going towards the horizon, the sense of people getting smaller in the background. That's all very well figured out as well. Another artist along the same veins, but kind of doing his own thing, is Botticelli. And this is a famous, famous image. You've probably seen it before. This is the Birth of Venus. But the Birth of Venus that didn't spring up out of nowhere. Botticelli is the one who created this work of art. And, one thing to know about these paintings is that they can look different in photographs because, any photograph is necessarily going to have to make some choices about how the light and the color are captured. So just bear that in mind when we try and compare these different ones to each other. But even in this rendition of it, it's clear to see there's a lot going on here. And we're really moving much more into the period of absolute realism or illusionistic realism. And on top of that, we're evoking ancient classical themes, ancient Greek and Roman stories. The story of Venus is that she was born from the ocean, actually born from the ocean after the god Cronus was castrated and his private parts were thrown into the ocean. So what does that say about Venus? But none of that sort of unpleasant, or Saturn in the Roman version. But none of that unpleasant stuff is present here. It's simply Venus being born from the ocean, being born from the sea, and being this almost sea goddess. And these other gods and goddesses sort of celebrating her emergence into the world. One of them is the Roman fertility goddess Pomona, who's associated with fruit and, and prosperity. And then we have 2 wind gods. There's debate about who they are. They are sort of blowing her hair and sort of welcoming her into the world. And so again, we have those Roman themes, and she is standing there looking all beautiful. And her the details of her anatomy are very fleshed out. You see a sense of her muscles and her stomach. We look at her face, it's quite detailed. Look at the individual strands of hair are right there. Yeah, when you see it from a distance, it maybe doesn't do it justice. So, I wonder how much we can zoom in here. I think we're going to end up dealing with image compression here, but, or we might have trouble with PowerPoint. But yeah, there's quite a lot going on here. And when you really look at those details, you can see all the details of what Botticelli was trying to capture. You can see the shape of her cheekbones in the patterns of light and shadow. So, you know, it's still clearly an illustration, but it's moving away from a more abstracted, or I might even say a cartoonish style, into something that more approaches this illusionistic realism. And Botticelli is presenting his own version of this classic story. Some people have seen her as an image of like sort of divine love. It's a concept that comes a lot in the Renaissance, is that the idea that the beauty of a beautiful woman could also be a symbol of the beauty of God, that you could kind of follow the path from human beauty to divine beauty. And that's an idea that comes from Plato. So it shows the influence of Plato during this time. Now that said, you know, I do highly suspect that a lot of these artists just like painting naked women and naked people in general. But you know, we shouldn't neglect more human motivations as well. Let's say that as an interpretation. Another one by Botticelli, this one looks a bit different because it's kind of got this black background with these dark trees. This is his one titled Primavera, or Spring, Latin for spring. And so this is, you know, people celebrating the springtime and these sort of gods and goddesses playing around in the springtime. Similar sort of mood. Okay, so those are some of our initial Renaissance painters. Next time we're going to get into some of the more famous ones like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, all the Ninja Turtles. We're going to get into those guys. But these are sort of our early Renaissance. And so the early Renaissance is starting off well with a lot of beauty and art. Later on in the later Renaissance, the Pope's going to come back, have more of an influence on the area, and it's going to be him who's commissioning some of these artists. But here's what I want to leave us with. We have this tendency to think of the Renaissance as this time period where things went from bad to good. You know, things started off like, you know, Middle Ages, oh, everything was bad. And then the Renaissance, things were good. But one of the most fascinating things in the world is that that's not how people living in that time period thought about it. For instance, in a letter by one of the people who was living in that time, Bentivoglio, Bentivoglio wrote that future generations will never believe how bad it was, and they will never forgive us for losing so much so quickly. So how does that square with the Renaissance and all this art and beauty we've been looking at? I think there's a couple of ways to respond to this. One of them is that just because it's a good time for art and a good time for new ideas doesn't necessarily mean it's a good time to be alive. And we almost had the reverse of that with the Middle Ages. It wasn't really a time of a lot of new ideas, or at least they weren't coming very fast, but that doesn't mean it was a bad time to be alive. It might have even been better to be a farmer in the Middle Ages than a farmer in Rome. So that's one aspect of it. We should decouple those things. Good art doesn't necessarily mean good times. And a golden age for art might be different from a golden age for people. Now, on the other hand, in some ways, maybe the bad stuff kind of spurred on the art. We had this constant competition in Italy, meaning there were all these power struggles. So if you happen to be unlucky enough to be caught up in one of these power struggles, if you ran afoul of the Medici or one of these other powerful families, you know, your life could be very nasty very quickly. And like I said, the plague was still happening. There were, you know, like 4 waves of plague that ran through Italy. And that's pretty terrifying. Life is short. You don't know what you're going to do. You're constantly running away from disease. But the leaders of that time, we could see them as almost like desperate for beauty and wonder and splendor, and trying to make beautiful things and pay for beautiful things to kind of put off these feelings of chaos and struggle and strife. And maybe that's why we have an interest in the noble human spirit, because we want to believe that there's something better than this. We want to believe that there's something better than just dealing with invasions and plague. So, you know, this really kind of, maybe this stress was actually the energy, and certainly the competition with other leaders was part of the energy that led to these new ideas in art and whatnot. And we should also remember that when people thought about change, they mostly thought about it as a decline from a greater past, that Rome had been great and things were downhill from here. And people often thought that in their own lifetimes, just because there was so much chaos and struggle, things were downhill from here as well. Now, on some level, we maybe know that these guys were wrong, that this Renaissance led in a lot of really good directions that we consider really valuable. And, this is going to lead to what's eventually known as the Enlightenment, where people develop theories of government like democracy and whatnot. And, thinking about what is the best way for people to live leads to better ways of thinking about how to live and better ways of living. But it's hard to recognize that at the ground level when you're in the thick of it. So these stressed out writers who think that everything is going downhill in their lifetime, they might not be able to see the bigger picture. On the other hand, maybe we should also say Renaissance, not a perfect time. And maybe, as a time traveler, the Renaissance might be a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. That's all worth keeping in mind. And I often think these days, there's a great article I have written down here kind of about the Renaissance and the Middle Ages and sort of contrasting some of the more traditional points of view on them, which is where I've drawn some of my ideas, including this quote. So go check that out if you want to learn more about this thought here. But one thing I keep thinking about is that we think we are living in a very stressful time, especially the last handful of years. There's a tendency to see, everything's falling apart. We don't know what the future will bring. And of course, we also live in a time of disease and plague that has stressed us out unimaginably, unimaginable to what we would have thought a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago. And so we think we are living in a time when everything's going downhill. But that might be just the current chaos that is going on. And over the larger trajectory, it might be that things are getting better. We have more people having more access to more information than ever before. We have technology that we didn't have before. We have art that we didn't have before. We have amazing artistic movements and all sorts of forms of beauty and wonder and joy that previous generations have not had access to. And so it's possible, I'm not saying I know for sure, but it's possible that our descendants might look back on this time period and think, wow, that was a time when, the greatest works of art were created, or the greatest video games, or the greatest pieces of music were created. And today, in my time period, I don't have that. But back then, everything was good. Or they might think, that was a stepping stone on the way to all the wonderful things that I am celebrating. And they would be able to just completely forget about the virus and about political stress and things like that, because that wasn't the thing that they were noticing, and they're thinking more on the long-term scale. I don't know. It's an interesting thought experiment. That's the question to think about is, how will we be remembered? And how will this time period be remembered? It might not be what you'd expect. And that's one of the most fascinating things about history, is that looking at things on the ground level is very different. And looking at things on the level of how ordinary people experienced it is very different from how it might look in retrospect. So I'll leave you guys thinking about that. Next time we'll learn about some of the absolute kings of the Renaissance men, and that will be pretty fun. So I'm looking forward to talking with you guys about that. Take care.